This episode, we talk about my background and why there's need of a change in understanding of what a theory is and how it is applied in paranormal research.
He runs towards things that go bump in the night. This is the Paranormal Theory with Topher the Paranormal Hobo, where he strips down current paranormal thought and tries to apply actual scientific theory to the field. Here is Topher.
That's right, I am Topher, and this is the Paranormal Theory podcast where I use my education to possibly map out a new way to look at my interest in the paranormal. But you're probably asking me why I should listen to you. Or better yet, like, who's this guy? For a little background on me, I'm an archaeologist who was in the field for a decade before having to get out and find a new home because of health concerns. But while I was a young pup and still in college, I was learning the basic theories of anthropology, and I started to realize that I could carry that information and critical thinking into crafting new theories for the paranormal field. I started looking at the core theories at the beginning of anthropology and archaeology and noticed that I could totally adapt them into the search for the paranormal. And this, I think, was around 2006 or 2007. So shows like Ghost Hunters and all of that were still like really big. And I think that honestly, in my opinion, was like the boom of paranormal programming was at its peak. But I wrote paper after paper about the need for more rigor in the research conducted, and it was met with a blind eye to the paranormal community that I was coming from, and like with laughter from the academic community that I was now like circulating in. So I did what anybody else would do. I just kind of ducked my head, focused on academic work. I got into the field, just did my job for the next 10 years. I mean, I wrote on occasion a thing or two, but I normally kept it in the realm of folklore. But that's enough about me. Let's talk about what this podcast is about. Each show, I will take an aspect of the state of the current theory and paranormal field, and then we can see if we can give ourselves a foundation to build up from and what is lacking. But before I get into this, let's thank today's sponsor.
Bearded Branding is an independently owned and operated branding, digital media, and marketing company that offers custom websites, social media plans, photography, and video content for entertainers such as bands, musicians, actors, and DJ. They use a mixture of strategies for helping their clients to promote themselves via all forms of social media and to show them how to create and maintain a strong, loyal audience. I've started using them and have noticed my engagement getting better, and my social media numbers have increased already. Check them out at beardedbranding.com or on Facebook at facebook.com/thebeardedbranding.
Yes, really. Thank you to our sponsor, Bearded Branding, for your sponsorship for today to help us get this show out. But back to the topic at hand. Many people ask, why investigate the paranormal? And this answer is simple. Why not? Admittedly, the subject has taken a different task for me since I started, on my education. I began looking at things a little differently. What I looked for when I was younger is not what I look for now. I started to get into this as a way to scare myself. It came to the point where I was almost a fear junkie. I fell in love with adrenaline and the fight or flight. And unfortunately, some of that has not changed. I really still get a kick out of like being scared. I love horror. I love being in that zone. What has changed is why I am still interested in research. I started to notice the change in myself and what I understood as I was working on my associate's degree in psychology. Short of what I call my flights of intellectual fantasy during one particular philosophy class, I was starting to see a more logical side of how things worked. I grew to look at why rather than what was out there. Why do certain people think a certain way? Why do certain people report certain phenomena? Why do we feel the need to go out and find this stuff and rush for the fear response? Why does a psychologist look at it in a cultural view? Say like a person who is suffering from schizophrenia reports auditory and visual hallucinations, but reports them in a culturally accepted form. Like they're not diagnosed with being schizophrenic. If a person believes that spirits are communicating with them and they do not hurt anyone, they're healthy. And that was where I was starting during beginning my education, like trying to piece that stuff together. I grew during this time to look at the field itself. Most of the preconceptions were that if I used technology to do what I was doing, I was being scientific. But when I moved from my associate's degree to my bachelor's in anthropology, I realized that I was totally wrong. That is the course of things that we're looking at in this series. This might not be everybody's cup of tea. I'm just going to be honest with you. Sometimes it might go over people's heads. I'm going to be using a lot of verbiage and talking about concepts that most people aren't familiar with. But what I'm going to be talking about is the core foundation of paranormal investigation and new theoretical constructs that we can use and apply them to the field as a whole to make them more scientific, to start understanding the reason why. Instead of cataloging what is, we need to know why we do things, why things happen, why things get brought up in a certain way. That is what we're going to be talking about today. And I know it's like 4 minutes into the thing, and I'm finally getting into like the meat of what today's topic is going to be. So just to let you know, in any general discussion of theory and method, there is inevitably an argumentative bias on the person who's coming up with it and presenting it. So I am going to acknowledge that yes, I have a little bit of a argumentative bias on bringing this forward, but I do it from a place of trying to bring everything back together. I believe that isolation and study of cultural beliefs, rather than an ad hoc series of conjecture and hypothesis, is the only meaningful approach to understanding the cultural process behind the interpretations of experience. A culture system is a set of constant or cyclically repetitive articulations between the social, technological, and ideological cosmology as adaptive means available to human populations, period. So what does all that mumbo jumbo mean? It means people don't interpret experiences the same way. Similarly, interpretations are not uniform at the same locations. So as groups of people vary, so do the basis for the beliefs and the reasonings that these people employ. That means the abandonment, replacement, and enculturation of beliefs from different locations where these groups of variable structure observe different values and ideologies. It creates an entire tapestry of beliefs in which we must unravel to understand the interpretations made by the members of that group. This tapestry is read in the cultural background and religious upbringing of the individuals. We might not always be able to state or determine what specific activities resulted in the observed interpretations, but we can recognize that more than just one event played in a role to produce these explanations. I hear footsteps. How do I know it was footsteps? We break that down. The structure of rationalization should, and in my opinion does, reflect all of the other structures of one person's life. For example, religious upbringing, economic position, folk background. All of these are summarized from the events which occurs as a part of normal functioning culture. It is my belief, and I'm going to stress this here, that I am proposing that we make a framework in which our work is in this field can be constructed. You're not going to hear the same reports from an Asian household as you would from a Hispanic household, or from, even you get more culturally isolated. A Japanese ancestry person who grew up in that culture is not going to report the same stuff or see the same stuff as important as somebody from Colombia. The cultural framework in which they live in is going to be totally different, but the events that they are reporting may be the exact same thing. So we need to change the methodology to make it to where it encompasses that, because that's what these things take place in the world today. You have multiple cultures you're going to be dealing with. You have multiple interpretations you're going to be dealing with. Is it an ancestor spirit? Is it a demon? Is it a nature spirit? Is it this? Is it that? All of these things, the person who's reporting to you is going to have this understanding, and you need to kind of pick apart and narrow down what it is that you're actually dealing with. When individuals started the pursuit to find the answers of these experiences, they didn't understand that. To start asking the question begs an answer before we even take it even further into the field. What are the goals and what are the aims of paranormal research? Are we documenting things, or are we trying to understand what they are and how people interact with them? That is okay, all we're doing is creating databases full of all of this ancillary stuff. We have no means to collate, get everything together and move forward. Most of the field would agree that they're striving to explain the experiences many people have from all over the globe and throughout history. But first, we have to understand the historical aspect of the paranormal before we strive to explain current interpretations. Most researchers assume the reports, regardless of their context or collection method, can be treated as equal and comparable traits. As in, traits in this point is like variables and components and whatnot. This trait has these things have this trait X X X X X. Once differences and similarities are defined in the terms of these equal and comparable traits, interpretation proceeds within something of a theoretical vacuum. There's no traditional concepts defined largely based on what has been postulated by the local quote-unquote experts or those proposed by television shows that act as surrogate instructors on interpretation. I suggest that this is an undifferentiated and unstructured view, and that is inadequate. That events, experiences having their origins in different culture systems will be reported with obvious differences and similarities in terms of the structure of the cultural system in which they are interpreted. Further, that the temporal and the spatial spans between reports will vary with the relationships between cultural beliefs and religious systems. There's a really interesting story. It is a part of folklore, but people still go out and look for it. There is a road in West Virginia where a woman in white is said to be all ripped up and whatnot, and she makes her way down the road. She's actually like hauled behind a carriage, road hauled down the road. And the beginning interpretation, when that story first happened, it was a Dutch servant who ran away. As our understanding and political views shifted, it became around the abolitionist time. This story was no longer a Dutch servant who was running away to go to her love of her life and still hadn't paid her debt, but it was an African American woman trying to get away and whatnot, and they had captured her and drug her back, and that was her reliving it all over again. The story had changed 3 or 4 times, but they were reporting the same stuff. To me, that's a really cool, interesting way about how an example of cultural beliefs, religious systems, and how it shapes how people relate stories to you, how it becomes something that you know for a fact. This is what we're doing, yada, 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 boom, boom, boom. We need the cultural idea. We need to know what these things are like. Why do we have 1,000 crybaby bridges in every state? Why do we have the theory? Why do we have the story of the vanishing hitchhiker? Why is it prevalent in more places than others? Why isn't this something that you see anywhere that had a semblance of car accidents and this, that, and the other? Why do you have the stories popping up all over the country about school bus accidents? Because that's a tragic thing in this culture. You have to piece all of that stuff together. Study of these distributions can potentially yield valuable information concerning the nature of the events and experiences. Explanation of the differences and similarities between events must be offered in terms of the current knowledge of the structure and functional characteristics of the cultural systems. The historical concept of explanations, as they are heavily in the field, is simply mechanisms of probable cause. They add nothing to the explanation of the process of cultural and individual interpretation. They seek explanation in systemic terms for events such as reported footsteps, physical contact, visible apparitions, etc. The only then, taking all of that in consideration, will we make a major contribution in the area of explanation and provide a basis for the future development of paranormal theory. That is where we have to begin. We have to start piecing this stuff together. As an exercise in the explanation of methodological questions we're bringing up here, I'll present general discussion of particular systemic approach in the evaluation of paranormal experiences and the potential evidence, and utilize these distinctions in an attempt to explain a particular set of observations. However, more to the point, I intend to provide a framework in which we can build on several observations, bring them all together, and provide a platform that makes these interpretations better from the field. So now that I got all that jargon out of the way and gave that long-winded explanation as to what I want to do and why I think it needs to be done, let's get to why I say it's a cultural thing and not just statistics and numbers. Remember, archaeology is a four-field science in America: archaeology, linguistics, physical anthropology, and cultural anthropology. Jokingly referred to by students as stones, tones, bones, and thrones. Get it? Stones, archaeology, tones, linguistics, bones, physical anthropology, and thrones, cultural anthropology. Who is in charge? Who is doing what? That type of stuff. We interpret an archaeological site by comparing it to another culture that we can see today and see if there's any similarities between the two. For instance, back some time ago, we found that there was 2 rings of debris that we'd find in prehistoric campsites. We were trying to figure out why we were seeing a small concentration in the center and then a large ring that was around the outside. Someone had the idea to look at a native hunting groups in the north and found that they tossed the small bones of their meal into the fire, and the larger sections and bones that were discarded as after they ate were tossed behind them as they sat. This gave the small bones in the center and the large bones being out and around the outside of it. They made the association that this explains why we found this in other sites and gave us a better understanding of what that group looked like in the past. So we can now say that, okay, this is a similar group. They have similar customs. We can start looking at the evidence to see if more of the stuff carries over. We can also look at historical sources and compare to what is said in those to what we see in the ground, and if there's a correlation. So if like the historic source says X happened, here's where it was at, and we go there and it's true, we find evidence of that, then we say the historical source is accurate, and we can infer the other items from that source should be the same. We still investigate it, but we start using that more as a guide to interpret what we are seeing than before. If there's a discrepancy, then we investigate further and find out what actually took place according to the record, and create new sources that can explain the difference and how we came to our current understanding. That way, people down the road understand how we came to those conclusions and where they come from there. I am just suggesting that we do that here with paranormal investigation and paranormal research. And what better way to do so than to look at the history of paranormal reports? Most people don't realize that ghost reports actually go back to the beginning of writing in most places. Because since the dawn of time, there has been accounts of ghosts visiting their relatives in order to pass on secrets or dire warning. From the 2nd century AD, we have what appears to be the very first ghost story from Pliny the Younger that talks about a house in Athens that is haunted by a spirit. And the spirit is of a dirty old man with scraggly beard, rattling chains, moving through the house. And it always vanishes on one spot. It was not until the scholar followed the ghost and marked the spot of the disappearance that they found the spirit was leading them to its corpse. Once the body, a skeleton wrapped in chains, was found and given a proper burial, the haunting stopped. As time goes on, ghost stories are even modified even more, and it changes to fit the current understanding of what the people involved. During Homer's time, ghosts were weak things that flitted from bodies of the deceased and hurried themselves down into Hades. There were no more consequence to the daily lives than just shadows. As time progressed, ghosts grew more solid and more dangerous. They would take on new aspects and new meanings behind their stuff. Another cultural widespread belief concerning ghosts was that they were composed of misty, airy, insubstantial material. Anthropologists speculate this is also stems from the early belief that ghosts were a person within a person. The ancient cultures would refer to them as a person's breath. Exhaling in colder climes appears visibly as a white mist. This belief may be also fostered in the metaphorical meaning of breath in certain language, such as Latin, spiritus, and the Greek pneuma, which by analogy becomes extended to mean the soul. In the Bible, God is depicted as animating Adam with a breath. Even though evidence for ghosts is largely anecdotal, the belief in ghosts throughout history has remained widespread and persistent. That's one of my favorite things. In many historical accounts, ghosts are thought to be a deceased person looking for vengeance or imprisoned on the earth for bad things they did during life. Most cultures have ghost stories in their mythologies. Many stories from the Middle Ages and the Romantic period rely on the macabre and the fantastic, and ghosts are a major theme in literature from those eras. Ghost stories date back to the ancient times, and it can be found in many, many different cultures. The Chinese philosopher Mo Zhu, 470 to 391 BC, is quoted as having said, "The way to find out whether anything exists or not is to depend on the testimony of the ears and the eyes of the multitude. If some have heard it or some have seen it, then we say it exists. If no one has heard it, no one has seen it, then we say that it does not exist. From antiquity to the present and the beginning of man, there have been men who have said that they've seen the bodies of ghosts and spirits and heard their voices. How can we say they don't exist? If none have heard them, none have seen them, how do we say they do? But those who deny the existence of the spirits say many in the world have heard and seen something of ghosts and spirits. Since they vary in testimony, who are they to be accepted as really having heard or seen them? Moses said, we rely on what many have jointly seen and what many have jointly heard. As a note, one of the kings executed his minister Tupou on false charges. Even after being warned that Tupou's ghost would seek revenge, 3 years later, according to historical sources, Tupou's ghost shot and killed him with a bow and arrow before an assembly of feudal lords. To put that in historical context, and this was beforehand. Like, this was years before Mozu was talking. That's just some of the history. I mean, that leads us up to the 70s, 75, 80s, and you get into the early 2000s and you see this new spin. And a new spin happens when you get like shows like Ghost Hunters and those who decide to take a more scientific, what they say is a more scientific approach. To them, it's just, if I use technology, I can do science. Instead of taking the time and accruing the data, you're like, okay, well, this has to be haunted. We got all these EVPs and we got all of the, this footage of stuff. That's just proof that ghosts exist. QED, we're done. But that's not what science is. Once we find those things, we need to take that just a step further and go with the idea that maybe we should be doing something to figure out what it is that people are experiencing. We can just call them ghosts and leave it at that, or we can actually experiment and find out what if the data that we're collecting is valuable or not. And that's kind of where we are leading into our next episode. Next time, we are going to be talking about laying the ground, the works, the foundations. Because right now, in my allegory, we have built the house of paranormal investigation theory on sand. We need to actually give it a foundation in which to rest. And some of the ideas that I have coming up in this series are like, application of systems theory, application of range theory, application of environmental theory, application of some of the mathematics that would help weed out and correlate whether or not certain data is more valuable than others. There's a lot of stuff, including new term usage that we should probably adapt, and a lot more. So next time that we get together, I'll be talking about systems theory, what it is, how it's implemented, and how I think that we can implement it into this field. You've been listening to the Paranormal Theory Podcast with Topher the Paranormal Hobo. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave it a rating and a review. But be sure to catch all of the latest from the Paranormal Theory Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at PF_Paranormal Files, on Twitter at Files Paranormal, and on Facebook and the Paranormal Hobo website. So on that note, thanks again, and we will see you next time.